When my husband stood frozen on the porch, his eyes locked on me and his father sitting too close together, the night air turned heavier than the summer heat. He didn't say a word, just stared, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and throat. My heart clenched, not from guilt, but from the terrifying thought that he might already know, might have pieced together the fragments of something I hadn't meant to happen. The glass of wine in my hand trembled, spilling a dark stain onto the wooden boards, but I couldn't move. His gaze flicked to the empty second glass beside me, to the way my body leaned slightly toward the man who wasn't him, and I could almost hear the sound of trust cracking like thin ice. The silence stretched between the three of us, louder than any accusation, sharper than any word he could have thrown. I swallowed hard, the way I do when I'm nervous, feeling the dryness in my throat scrape against the taste of what we'd become. That was the moment I knew there was no undoing this, no explanation that could make it harmless, no excuse that could erase it. But the truth is, it didn't start on that porch. It began months earlier, in a way that felt almost innocent, almost harmless. I need to tell you how we got here. Before I unravel this secret I've guarded so tightly, tell me, have you ever found yourself keeping something you thought you could hide forever, only to realize too late that the weight of it was already changing everything? The first week after the funeral felt like walking through a house made of fog, every corner blurry, every sound muffled, every breath heavy. My husband thought moving in for a while would help his father adjust, help him not feel so unbearably alone. I agreed, thinking it was the right thing to do, the kind of thing a good daughter-in-law would do. But I didn't expect how strange it would feel, carrying my suitcase into a house where every wall held another woman's life. Her scent still clung to the curtains, her handwriting marked the spice jars in the kitchen, her slippers sat neatly under the bed as if she might step into them at any moment. I spent hours cleaning, not because anyone asked me to, but because I couldn't stand the stillness. Dust had gathered on shelves no one had touched for months, and as I wiped it away, I found pieces of her, an old grocery list, a half-finished crossword puzzle, a scarf she'd folded neatly but never worn again. Each discovery made my chest tighten with something I couldn't name. I wasn't jealous of her, how could I be? She was gone. But standing in her kitchen, touching her things, I felt like an intruder in a museum of a marriage that had lasted decades. My husband stayed busy, calling banks and lawyers, sorting through papers, leaving early in the mornings for work. Just a few weeks, he said, like he was reassuring himself as much as me. We'll stay here until Dad gets settled. But those few weeks started to feel longer the moment he began sleeping at the office some nights, insisting it was easier than the commute. That left me and his father alone in the house more often than I'd expected. The evenings were the hardest. We would sit in the kitchen, the two of us, with a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. At first we talked about simple things, what groceries we needed, how to repair the broken fence, the state of the garden. His voice was low and steady, but when he spoke of her, of the woman he had buried, something in him shifted. She used to hum when she cooked, he said one night, staring at the untouched pot of soup between us. I keep thinking I hear it. Then I remember I can't. I didn't know how to respond, so I offered him more soup he didn't really want. It felt wrong to pry, but even more wrong to leave the silence untouched. And somewhere in that silence, I began noticing the small things, how he leaned against the counter when I was cooking, how he watched me move around the kitchen, not inappropriately, not then. Just present. Like he was seeing me. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself it was nothing. But I felt my pulse change when his hand brushed mine as I passed him a dish, felt the weight of his gaze linger a moment too long on the way I folded a towel. I hated that I noticed. The house itself didn't make it easier. It wasn't just walls and windows, it was an archive of everything that had been lost. There were photographs in every hallway, weddings, vacations, birthdays. I couldn't walk past them without feeling their lives pressed against me, like the past was watching. Sometimes I caught him standing in front of those frames too, his eyes glassy, his fingers touching the glass as though it might bring her back. One afternoon, I found him in the garage, kneeling by a box of her shoes. He held one in his hand, a small flat with a worn sole, and stared at it like it held the answer to something. He didn't hear me come in at first. When he did, he set the shoe down too quickly, like he was embarrassed. I wanted to tell him it was okay to miss her, to grieve her, but the words felt thin. Instead, I picked up another shoe, brushed the dust off, and placed it gently back in the box. I started taking on tasks without thinking: laundry, grocery lists, even sorting mail. It wasn't because anyone asked. It was because the house felt too heavy, and I thought if I moved enough, maybe I could lift some of that weight. He thanked me more than once, quietly, in the evenings. "You've brought life back here," he said one night, almost to himself as he poured tea. I should have taken it as what it was, as gratitude, nothing more. But the words stayed with me. By the end of the first week, the routine was set, my husband gone most of the day, me running the house, and his father lingering nearby. Sometimes he'd offer to help, holding a ladder steady as I changed a light bulb or lifting boxes I couldn't reach. He wasn't overbearing, just present. Too present. And then there was the night I couldn't stop replaying in my mind. We were in the living room, and I bent down to pick up a blanket that had fallen to the floor. He reached for it at the same time, his fingers brushing mine. It lasted only a second, but it left a spark, the tiniest jolt, like static electricity. I told myself it was nothing. But later, lying in the guest bed, listening to the creak of the old house around me, I thought about that spark. I thought about how long it had been since I'd felt noticed, not loved, not cared for, but simply seen. My husband loved me, I knew he did. But love and attention aren't always the same thing. I turned onto my side, staring at the shadow of the window frame on the wall. The house was silent, but my mind wasn't. I didn't know it then, but that silence would become the most dangerous thing of all. The second week began differently, though I didn't notice the shift until it was already in motion. My husband left early on Monday morning with a quick kiss on my cheek, muttering something about meetings in the city that might run late. He tossed his bag into the trunk and drove away without looking back at the house, as if leaving was easy for him now. I watched from the doorway, the sound of his car fading, and for a moment the silence afterward felt almost too thick, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I told myself it would be like any other day. But it wasn't. By noon, the house had taken on a new kind of stillness. I folded laundry in the living room while his father sat nearby, quietly sorting through old paperwork at the coffee table. He didn't speak much at first, but every so often, he'd hold up a document or photo, sharing a brief memory before slipping it back into the box. It felt almost ceremonial, as though we were cataloging pieces of a life that had ended but still lingered in these rooms. Later, I found myself in the attic, tugging open a heavy box labeled winter clothes. The dust made me sneeze, and I heard his footsteps coming up the stairs. "You should wear a mask," he said gently, standing in the doorway. His voice had a warmth that surprised me, not intrusive, just present. He crossed the room and took the box from me, setting it down with ease I no longer had. I caught myself looking at his hands, the way his veins stood out under the skin, the strength in the small gesture. It was nothing, just help, but I noticed it. Too much. The afternoon dragged into evening, and still my husband hadn't called. We cooked dinner together, an unplanned collaboration. He chopped vegetables without asking, moving beside me like we'd been doing it for years. The rhythm of it was strange but comforting, two people filling a silence with the clink of knives and the hiss of a pan. At the table, he spoke of repairs that needed to be done around the house. "The back fence is weak. Might fall if there's a storm," he murmured, his eyes on his plate. I nodded, offering to help paint it when the weather warmed. It was ordinary conversation, the kind couples and families have every day, and yet it didn't feel ordinary at all. After dinner, we stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary. I washed dishes, and he dried them, our movements brushing past each other again and again. At one point, I passed him a wet glass, and his fingers lingered a fraction longer than needed on mine. Not deliberate, not blatant, but enough to make me inhale too sharply. I told myself to stop noticing. I told myself I was being ridiculous. When the phone finally rang, it was my husband, calling from some nameless hotel. His voice was distracted, almost distant, as he explained that his meetings were running late, that he might need to stay in the city for a few days. "It's just easier," he said, as if logistics excused the absence. I reassured him, saying I understood. And I did. But when I hung up, the house felt emptier than before. That night, we ended up in the living room again, the TV murmuring in the background though neither of us was watching. I sat on the couch with a blanket over my lap, and he took the armchair across from me. For a while, there was no conversation, just the faint hum of the television and the sound of rain starting against the windows. He spoke suddenly, almost startling me. "I still reach for her side of the bed in the morning." His words were quiet, but they landed heavily. I wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words felt too small for his grief. Instead, I said, "That's normal." My voice came out softer than I expected. He nodded, looking down at his hands. "Doesn't feel normal." The rain outside grew steadier, filling the gaps between our words. I thought about my husband's absence, about how many nights like this there might be. I told myself it was just loneliness, his, mine, the house's. Nothing more. But then it happened. I had stood to take the empty teacups back to the kitchen, and as I passed him, his hand reached out, not forceful, not even fully conscious. Just a gentle hold on my wrist, enough to make me stop. Our eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither of us moved. It felt like the world had shrunk to that single point of contact, his fingers warm around my wrist, the air suddenly too thin. And then, we kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't spoken. It just happened. The instant it was over, I stepped back, heart hammering, my breath uneven. He didn't try to pull me back. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, his hands dropping into his lap, his eyes cast downward as if he was ashamed, or maybe just afraid. I didn't speak either. I didn't know what to say. I carried the cups into the kitchen, my hands trembling, the porcelain clinking against the sink. I stood there for what felt like minutes, staring at the faucet, at the tiny streams of water dripping from the tap. I told myself it was nothing. A mistake. A moment of weakness. But when I finally went upstairs, every creak of the wooden steps felt louder than usual. I closed the guest room door behind me, leaning against it for a second before sliding down to sit on the floor. I pressed my palms to my face and whispered into the dark, though there was no one to hear me. It was just one moment. But I already knew it would not leave me. The morning after felt heavy, though nothing looked different. The same pale curtains filtered the same sunlight into the kitchen, the same teapot sat on the stove, and the same clock ticked a steady rhythm against the wall. But when I came downstairs and saw him sitting at the table, sipping coffee, the air felt denser, charged in a way it hadn't been before. I hesitated at the doorway for a moment, my fingers curled around the frame, watching him stir sugar into his cup. It wasn't the action, it was the fact that I couldn't look at him without remembering what had happened the night before. We didn't mention it. Neither of us said anything about the kiss, though the memory of it sat between us like another presence at the table. I made breakfast with deliberate calmness, cracking eggs, slicing bread, forcing my hands to move like everything was normal. He murmured something about the weather, about how it might rain again in the afternoon. His voice was level, casual, as though nothing had changed. But I could feel that something had. All morning, the house felt smaller. Every hallway seemed narrower, every room more confining. When we passed each other in the kitchen or the living room, we left wider gaps between our bodies, as if space could erase what happened. I kept thinking of my husband, of the way he'd left without even looking back yesterday. I thought of his distracted voice on the phone, the long silences in his calls lately. It wasn't anger I felt toward him, just a hollow distance, as though we'd been living side by side, but not really together, for longer than I'd admitted. By early afternoon, I found myself pacing. He suggested we drive into town for groceries, and I agreed too quickly, maybe because I needed to leave the house, maybe because I didn't trust myself to stay in it. The drive felt oddly normal. The hum of the engine filled the silences, the road stretched ahead in quiet curves. At one point, he turned on the radio, and an old song played, something from the 80s, soft, familiar. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur past, and thought about how strange it was that life could look so ordinary even when everything inside felt unsettled. In the store, we walked separately, pushing the cart together but drifting down different aisles. He reached for things without asking, cereal, bread, the brand of coffee his wife had always bought. I picked up fruit, vegetables, flour. To anyone watching, we might have looked like a couple, not a daughter-in-law and father-in-law. That thought unsettled me. When we returned, unloading the groceries felt almost absurdly domestic. He carried the heavier bags, setting them on the counter, and I caught the way his hand brushed the small of my back as he moved past me. It was brief, almost unintentional, but it made my breath hitch. I kept thinking of the kiss. I kept telling myself it was a mistake, that mistakes don't have to mean more. But mistakes have a way of echoing. Later that afternoon, I was in the garden pulling weeds when I felt him nearby. He had come out with a glass of water for me, setting it on the edge of the bench. I thanked him, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't linger, but I felt his eyes on me as I worked, and I hated how aware I was of it. By evening, my husband still hadn't called. The absence of his voice left too much room for other thoughts to creep in. We ate dinner quietly, the clinking of forks louder than any conversation. I noticed his hands again, how strong they looked, how steady. I hated that my eyes kept finding them. After dinner, I washed the dishes while he dried them. The rhythm of it felt too easy, too familiar, like a life I hadn't meant to step into. At one point, our fingers touched when I handed him a plate. We both froze for a fraction of a second, then pulled back almost at the same time. It was just a plate. But it wasn't. The night ended without words, each of us retreating to separate rooms. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house creak and sigh. I thought of my husband, of the life we had built, of the promises we made. And I thought of the kiss, the weight of it, the way it wouldn't leave me. I told myself I could control this. But even then, lying there in the dark, I already knew control was slipping. The following days blurred into a routine that looked normal from the outside, but every movement felt sharper, every silence more deliberate. I told myself I needed distance, that if I stayed busy, if I avoided being alone in the same room with him for too long, the kiss would shrink into just a strange memory. But the house made that impossible. It wasn't a mansion where we could stay out of each other's way. It was an older, modest home where the kitchen was the heart of everything, the hallway always too narrow, the walls too thin. By Wednesday morning, I was already restless. I cleaned rooms that didn't need cleaning, folded laundry that wasn't mine, moved objects from one shelf to another, anything to keep my hands busy. But each time I turned around, I'd see him, in the living room, reading the paper, in the yard, trimming a hedge that barely needed trimming. He wasn't hovering, but he was always there. It would have been easier if he'd been distant, cold, if there had been something to resent. But he wasn't. He was kind. Thoughtful in ways that didn't feel forced. When the old door in the laundry room stuck, he fixed it without being asked. When I burned my finger on a pan, he appeared with ice, no questions, no fuss. Those small acts should have been harmless, yet they made it harder to build the distance I thought I needed. That afternoon, he suggested we go outside. "It's warm enough to check the pool," he said, almost offhand, like it was an errand that had to be done. At first I hesitated, standing in the doorway with my arms folded, but eventually I followed him into the yard. The pool hadn't been used in months. Leaves floated on the surface, and the water looked dull, a forgotten part of the house. He skimmed the surface with a net, his movements quiet and efficient. I watched from a few steps away, telling myself I was just there to help if needed. When he reached for a bucket, I bent down to hold it steady. Our shoulders brushed, an accidental touch, brief but unmistakable. I straightened quickly, telling myself it meant nothing, and yet my skin felt aware of that fleeting contact for the rest of the afternoon. Later, he asked me to hand him a towel. I did, careful not to look at him too long, but the air between us felt heavy. I kept thinking of my husband, of the way he used to notice these kinds of things, my new dress, my favorite tea, the way I tucked my hair behind my ear. Lately, he hadn't been looking at me like that. Maybe he was tired. Maybe we'd both just stopped paying attention. As the sun went down, we sat on the edge of the yard, our shoes off, our feet in the grass. The air smelled faintly of chlorine and damp leaves. He talked about the pool repairs, about what would need to be done if anyone wanted to use it again. His voice was steady, neutral, but there was something in the way he glanced at me, something that wasn't neutral at all. That night, the house was quieter than usual. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards as we moved around in different rooms. When I went to bed, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, telling myself this wasn't going anywhere, that it couldn't. But each day seemed to make that harder to believe. The next morning, I decided I needed space, not just from him, but from the house itself. I told him I was going into town for errands and drove to the small market, even though we didn't need much. I wandered the aisles, lingering by shelves, grateful for the distraction of strangers and noise. But even there, my thoughts didn't leave me alone. When I returned, he was in the kitchen fixing the squeaky cabinet door. He didn't look up right away, just kept working, but when our eyes met, there was a moment, a fraction of a second, where neither of us spoke. Dinner that evening was quiet again, but not tense. That almost made it worse. It felt like we were slipping into a rhythm, and that rhythm scared me. After dinner, I washed the dishes while he wiped the counters. The room felt warm from the steam of the sink, and when I reached for a dish he was holding, his hand brushed mine again. A simple, accidental thing, but it didn't feel simple. When I went to bed that night, I knew I was lying to myself. I had been telling myself the kiss was an isolated mistake, that it would fade. But it wasn't fading. And worse, I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The week stretched on, each day folding into the next with an unsettling sameness. The house seemed to pulse with a quiet tension, as if it held its breath along with us. My husband's absence was no longer just a fact, it had become a void I felt in every room, every shadow. The days grew longer, and so did the hours I spent alone with his father, the two of us circling a line neither dared to cross aloud but both felt beneath the skin. It was late afternoon when he suggested we sit on the veranda, the old wooden porch that faced the garden. The sun was dipping low, casting long golden fingers across the floorboards. He brought out 2 glasses of wine, the kind his wife used to drink on quiet evenings. I watched as he poured carefully, the red liquid catching the light and spilling warmth onto the glass. We sat side by side, the cool breeze carrying the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass. The air felt thick with things unsaid, but the comfort of silence was a balm in itself. He spoke softly about the house, about memories trapped in the walls, about how the garden seemed different without her laughter. His voice was steady but laced with an ache I could almost reach out and touch. I listened, letting the words wash over me, while my fingers toyed nervously with the rim of my glass. I had changed my clothes that afternoon, soft fabric, something loose and simple. A small concession to the stirring feelings I refused to acknowledge fully. The way the light caught the folds of the fabric, the way the breeze brushed my skin, it all made me acutely aware of my own presence. He reached over to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was gentle, deliberate. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us. The wine glasses rested forgotten on the table as he leaned in, and we kissed. The kiss was brief but charged, an undeniable shift in the space between us. When we pulled apart, neither spoke. The silence stretched long enough to feel like a conversation in itself. I didn't want to ruin the moment by saying anything, and I don't think he did either. Instead, we sat quietly, letting the evening deepen around us. The cicadas began their nightly song, a chorus that filled the spaces where words might have been. Later, inside the house, I went through the motions of preparing dinner, but my mind was elsewhere. The taste of the wine lingered, the feel of his lips on mine pressed against my skin like a secret too heavy to carry alone. I caught my reflection in the window, a woman I barely recognized, caught between what I knew was right and the pull of something forbidden. The phone rang just as I was setting the table. It was my husband, calling from a hotel room hundreds of miles away. His voice was tired but steady, asking about the day, about plans for the coming week. I answered carefully, keeping my tone light, hiding the storm that was gathering inside me. When I hung up, I stared out into the darkened garden, the last embers of the sunset fading. I felt the weight of the choice I was making, not with words, but with every look, every touch that was becoming harder to ignore. That night, sleep was elusive. I lay awake, hearing the house breathe, feeling the space beside me empty and cold. I wondered how long this balance could last, how long I could keep pretending that nothing had changed. The next day brought no relief. I moved through the house with a strange new awareness, every glance and gesture charged with meaning. He was there in the kitchen when I made coffee, leaning against the counter with a quiet smile that reached his eyes. I caught myself watching him, tracing the lines of his face, the way his hands moved. I told myself to focus on practical things, fixing the fence, preparing the garden for spring, but my thoughts drifted back to that kiss on the veranda. I replayed it again and again, the softness of his lips, the heat of his breath. When I looked at my husband's wedding band on my finger, it felt heavier somehow, a reminder of promises made long ago that now seemed distant. By evening, the tension in the house was palpable. We ate in silence, the clatter of cutlery punctuating the quiet. Afterward, he suggested we walk in the garden to clear our heads. The night air was cool and still, the stars just beginning to appear. We walked side by side, close but not touching. The earth beneath our feet smelled of damp soil and growing things. He stopped beside the blooming rose bushes, their petals heavy with fragrance. He reached out to touch one, brushing a thorn away with care. She loved these, he said quietly. Spent hours tending them. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. They're beautiful. He turned to me then, his eyes searching mine. The words caught in his throat, but the look he gave me spoke volumes. That night, the house felt charged with an energy I couldn't name. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something dangerously close to hope. I knew the line we'd crossed was no longer invisible. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of routine and quiet unease. I moved through the house as though on autopilot, doing the same chores, walking the same halls, but everything felt heavier, more loaded. Even the smallest things seemed to hold meaning now, the way his chair scraped softly against the kitchen floor, the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the pause in his breathing when our paths crossed. I told myself I could handle it, that if I simply kept moving, I could control the situation, keep the lines from blurring any further. But each time I tried to create distance, the house pushed us back together. It was too small for avoidance, too quiet to let thoughts settle. On Tuesday morning, I woke before dawn, hoping that starting early would ease the tension. I tiptoed down to the kitchen, thinking I might have the space to myself for an hour, maybe two. But when I flicked on the light, he was already there, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee in his hands, staring at nothing. The sight of him startled me, not because he was doing anything unusual, but because of how much I felt in that ordinary moment. He looked up, met my eyes briefly, and then returned his gaze to the dark swirl in his cup. Neither of us said much. I poured my own coffee, stirring it slowly, waiting for the silence to feel less suffocating. Later that day, we drove into town together, this time for things we genuinely needed: paint for the fence, a new garden hose, groceries to fill the empty shelves. The car was filled with the hum of the road and the soft drone of the radio. We spoke only occasionally, but even that was enough to make my chest tighten. When we got to the hardware store, I walked ahead to browse paint colors while he spoke with an employee about wood treatments. It felt strangely intimate, choosing things for a house that wasn't mine, making decisions that would outlast my stay. He came over to where I stood comparing shades of white and said, "She always liked warmer tones." I nodded, my fingers brushing across the paint cards. I shouldn't have cared what she liked or didn't like, but hearing her name spoken again, her preferences lingering like a ghost in the conversation, made my chest ache in a way I didn't expect. Back at the house, we spent the afternoon in the yard, clearing away branches and moving furniture from the patio. The day was warm, the sun sharp enough to leave my skin flushed, and by late afternoon, we were both sweating and tired. I caught him watching me at one point, not staring, not obvious, just a fleeting look as I brushed hair from my face. That look stayed with me. The evening brought another call from my husband. He talked about meetings, about deadlines, about how long he might be away. His voice was practical, almost cheerful, but it felt distant, as if the phone line stretched between two different lives. I answered his questions, gave updates about the house, the errands, the fence. I didn't tell him about the weight in the air, the moments I didn't know how to name. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand, feeling something twist in my stomach. The next day, the air felt heavy, rain threatening in the sky. He suggested we go to the market before the weather turned, and I agreed. We walked through narrow aisles, our hands brushing once when we both reached for the same basket of apples. Neither of us said anything, but my heart skipped anyway. Back home, the storm finally came. Rain pelted the windows, the sky darkened, and the house filled with the steady drum of water on the roof. We stayed inside, side by side but not too close, finding things to do. He fixed a cabinet door while I folded laundry. We moved around each other carefully, like we were both aware of a fragile line we couldn't see but knew was there. That night, as the rain slowed, I found myself in the living room, turning off lamps one by one. He was sitting in the armchair, reading, though his eyes weren't on the page. When I passed him on my way upstairs, his hand brushed mine as he handed me the book he'd been holding. The touch was brief but enough to send a jolt through me, the memory of the veranda, the kiss, everything we hadn't said rushing back in one wave. I lay awake again that night, the sound of the rain fading, my heart restless. I thought of my husband, of his voice on the phone, of how far away he felt. And I thought of the house, the man down the hall, and the line between us that was thinner than ever. The storm from the night before left the world washed clean, but inside the house nothing felt lighter. The walls still held the same tension, the same unspoken words hanging between every glance and every movement. I woke earlier than usual, lying still for a long time before forcing myself out of bed. I could hear the faint creak of floorboards in the hallway, his footsteps, and the realization that we were awake at the same time made my chest tighten. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and rain. He was already there, leaning against the counter, stirring sugar into his cup. He looked up when I entered, offering the smallest smile, the kind that didn't demand one in return. I poured my own coffee, our silence louder than any greeting. We both tried to treat the day like any other, but the weight of what we weren't saying seemed to seep into everything. I cleaned the kitchen, rearranging drawers just to have something to do, while he went outside to check the fence we'd painted the week before. Through the window, I watched him lift the gate off its hinges, his shoulders straining under the effort. When he came back in, his shirt was damp from the dew in the grass, his hands marked with smudges of dirt and paint. He asked if I wanted to help him clear the shed, and I agreed before I even thought about it. The shed smelled of wood and dust, stacked with boxes and tools that hadn't been touched in years. We moved carefully in the cramped space, handing each other objects, setting things aside, sweeping out cobwebs. At one point, I climbed a small ladder to reach a shelf and felt it wobble under my weight. Before I could steady myself, his hands were at my waist, grounding me. The touch was firm but careful, just enough to keep me from losing balance. "Got it," he murmured, almost an afterthought. I nodded, though he couldn't see my face from where he stood. My fingers tightened around the box I was reaching for, not because it was heavy, but because of the rush of heat that came with that moment of contact. We finished the shed, but the air between us felt changed again, more fragile than before. By afternoon, the sky had turned gray again, though the rain held off. He suggested we bring the chairs from the veranda into the garage before another storm ruined them. We carried them together, weaving through narrow doorways and awkward corners, our hands brushing more than once on the wooden frames. Each accidental touch lingered longer in my mind than it should have. Dinner came and went quietly. The clatter of forks on plates filled the silence we couldn't. I washed dishes afterward, the water running warm over my hands, while he dried them and placed them back in the cupboards. The domesticity of it all made my stomach twist, not because it felt wrong, but because of how natural it had started to feel. The night deepened. The house settled into its usual creaks and sighs. I went upstairs, intending to read in bed, to distract myself, to will the heaviness in my chest into something manageable. But the book stayed unopened on the nightstand. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, every thought circling the same center. I heard him moving down the hall, the soft sound of his door opening and closing, the boards whispering under his weight. The silence after each step was a reminder of how close we were, not just physically, but to something neither of us had said out loud. At some point, I stopped pretending to read, stopped pretending to sleep. I got up, bare feet on the cool wood floor, and stood at my door with my hand on the knob for what felt like forever. The house was utterly still. I opened the door, and there he was, standing at the far end of the hallway. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. I walked toward him. Or maybe he took a step first. I don't remember who moved, only that suddenly the space between us wasn't there anymore. We spent the night together. The morning came too fast. The light through the curtains felt harsher, more revealing. I woke before he did and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands as if they could hold the answers I didn't have. Downstairs, the coffee tasted the same, but nothing else did. The house didn't feel washed clean. It felt marked, as if every room now carried something we could never take back. The morning after was sharper than I expected, like stepping into cold air you weren't ready for. The thin line we had crossed the night before lingered in every breath, in every sound of the house as it woke around us. I moved through the kitchen like an intruder, every motion too careful, too quiet, as though making noise would draw attention to what had already happened. He was there before me, as usual, already dressed, already drinking coffee. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes did not quite meet mine. I poured myself a cup and sat down, forcing my hands to stay steady as I stirred in sugar. The silence between us felt brittle, like glass. One wrong move and it would shatter into something we couldn't sweep back under the rug. Breakfast was nothing more than toast and coffee, but I barely tasted either. Every sound, the scrape of his chair, the clink of his spoon, seemed to echo. We spoke little. He mentioned the weather, and I nodded. He asked if we needed milk from the store, and I said yes, though I wasn't sure we did. Each word felt like we were acting out a version of normal, one we no longer believed in. After breakfast, I retreated to the laundry room, throwing myself into folding clothes, just to hear the steady rhythm of fabric in my hands. I thought it would help, but it didn't. Each shirt, each towel was another reminder of how domestic this all felt, and how dangerous that feeling had become. The phone rang late that morning. It was my husband, calling from the city. His voice was brisk but familiar, the way it always was when he was half distracted with work. He asked about the house, about his father, about errands that needed running. I told him what I thought he wanted to hear, that things were fine, that we were taking care of the house, that everything was under control. He didn't know my voice cracked slightly on that last sentence. After the call, the quiet felt louder than before. I stood for a long time by the window, staring out at the yard. The grass was wet from dew, the air carrying that clean scent after rain. He walked across the yard, hammer in hand, heading for the fence. He looked like any man fixing any ordinary thing, but my heart pounded like he was carrying my secret across the grass with every step. By early afternoon, he came back inside and suggested we drive into town. He said we needed supplies, but I wondered if either of us actually cared about what was on the list. I said yes anyway, grateful for the excuse to leave the house, though the car felt just as confining. The drive was quiet, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of something in the back seat. I stared out the window at passing fields and houses, but my mind wasn't outside, it was in the kitchen, on the veranda, in every moment that had led us here. At the store, we walked side by side, never too close, never too far. Our conversation was clipped, practical, about prices, about which brand of coffee was on sale. But in the spaces between words, there was too much unsaid. At one point, our hands brushed when we both reached for the same box of tea. The touch was nothing, fleeting, but it made my breath catch just the same. Back home, we unpacked the groceries in silence. The bags crinkled, the fridge door opened and closed, and with every ordinary movement, the weight of what we had done grew heavier. Dinner that night felt staged, like two actors playing roles they no longer fit into. He passed me the salt, I thanked him. He asked if I wanted more bread, I said no. Every exchange felt rehearsed, hollow. When the dishes were done, I lingered at the sink longer than necessary, my fingers in the warm water, my eyes unfocused. I could see him in the reflection of the darkened window behind the counter. He was standing there, drying the last plate, his shoulders slightly tense, his mouth set in a line that wasn't quite neutral. Neither of us spoke, and yet the silence felt like a conversation we weren't ready to have. That night, I went upstairs early, hoping the quiet of my room would dull the noise in my mind. It didn't. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ring on my finger, twisting it slowly, feeling its weight like it was heavier than metal should ever be. I thought about my husband, about his voice on the phone, about the years we'd built together, about the trust he assumed was unshakable. And I thought about the man down the hall, about the line we'd crossed, about the fact that there was no pretending anymore that nothing had happened. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, the silence of the house seemed to press closer, reminding me that some things can't be undone, and that whatever came next would not leave anyone untouched. The day my husband returned started out like any other, though nothing about the way the morning felt was ordinary. The house woke slowly, sunlight crept across the floorboards, the smell of coffee filled the air, and yet my chest felt tight from the moment I opened my eyes. I moved through my routine carefully, as if walking on glass, aware of every motion, every sound. He was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, stirring sugar into his cup the way he always did. He nodded a silent greeting, and I poured my own coffee, neither of us saying much. Words felt dangerous now, like they might spill something we couldn't control. I tried to focus on small things, wiping crumbs from the counter, watering the plant on the windowsill, but everything reminded me of the weight we carried. The chair he sat in. The mug in his hands. Even the simple sound of the kettle boiling. All of it tied to moments I couldn't untangle from memory. Around midday, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my husband, driving back tonight. Be home late. My stomach clenched as I stared at the screen. I typed out a reply, short, neutral, the kind of thing a wife might send without thinking. Asterisk okay. Drive safe asterisk, but I didn't feel safe. The hours ahead of me suddenly seemed too long and too short at the same time. The afternoon stretched. He worked outside, fixing the fence again, hammering nails that didn't really need hammering. I stayed inside, cleaning rooms that didn't really need cleaning. We orbited each other carefully, speaking little, both of us pretending the message hadn't changed the air in the house. By evening, I started dinner, my hands moving automatically, slicing vegetables, stirring a pot, setting the table. He came in from the yard, his shirt faintly damp from the cool evening air, and without a word he began helping, setting down plates, lighting the small lamp in the corner. The dinner itself was quiet. Forks scraping gently against plates, glasses touching the table with soft thuds, all filling the silence we didn't know how to break. It felt like a performance, each of us reciting lines from a script we no longer believed in. As I cleared the dishes, the phone rang. My husband's voice filled the kitchen, distant but steady. He told me how the traffic was, how long it might take, how tired he was from the drive. I told him dinner would be waiting, that we'd see him soon. My voice sounded calm, even warm, but my fingers tightened on the receiver hard enough to leave marks. The hours between that call and his arrival passed in a blur. I set the table again, this time for 3, making sure every fork and spoon lined up perfectly. He helped quietly, and though our hands never touched, every movement felt charged, like we were holding back an entire storm with nothing but silence. When headlights finally swept across the driveway, my heart jumped. The sound of tires on gravel was louder than it should have been. My husband stepped inside, suitcase in hand, jacket over his arm. He smiled faintly, the kind of tired smile of someone who just wants to be home. I met him at the door. He kissed me lightly on the cheek, and the gesture felt both familiar and foreign all at once. He hugged his father next, the embrace brief but real. The scene could have been any family reunion on any ordinary night. We sat down to eat, the 3 of us, the table suddenly feeling too small. My husband talked about his trip, meetings, traffic, the hotel breakfast he couldn't stand. I nodded, laughed lightly in the right places, but every word felt like a thin sheet stretched over something that couldn't stay hidden forever. He didn't notice the glances. At least, I told myself he didn't. The way my eyes darted away when his father looked at me, the way I hesitated before reaching for the breadbasket he held out. After dinner, my husband stood, saying he needed fresh air after the long drive. He stepped out onto the veranda, the screen door creaking softly as it shut behind him. I stayed behind, gathering plates, my hands trembling slightly as I stacked them. The kitchen light felt too bright. He stood across from me, drying a dish, and for a moment our eyes met, and I felt everything tighten inside my chest. The sound of the screen door creaking again broke the moment. My husband stepped back in, his face unreadable. He looked at us, at the way we stood too still, too far apart, yet somehow not far enough. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence that followed felt heavier than words could ever be. That night, after the dishes were done, after my husband went upstairs to unpack, the house felt different. Not quieter, no, the opposite. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator felt loud, intrusive, like the house itself knew something had shifted. I sat on the edge of the bed later, staring at my hands, at the small marks from the dishes, from the day. There was no undoing what had been done. And for the first time, I wasn't sure what would come next. The morning after his return felt different, though not in the way I had imagined. The house seemed to hold its breath, like the walls knew there was something unspoken between the three of us. I woke early, though I barely slept at all, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before I moved. My husband was still asleep, his breathing steady, his face turned toward the window. He looked peaceful, unaware of the storm I felt inside me. Downstairs, the kitchen was already awake. The smell of coffee hung in the air, and his father was at the table, as usual, hands wrapped around his mug. But now, there was another presence in the house, my husband's suitcase by the door, his shoes on the mat, his voice still echoing faintly in the halls from the night before. I made breakfast quietly, keeping my movements careful. I cracked eggs, toasted bread, and the sound of each action seemed louder than it should have been. My husband joined us a few minutes later, hair still mussed from sleep, rubbing his eyes like a man trying to shake off a long drive. The three of us sat at the table, a triangle of silence that felt impossible to break. My husband spoke first, his voice casual, asking about errands, about repairs around the house. I answered simply, giving him only what he needed. His father said even less, keeping his eyes on his coffee, but I could feel him thinking, the weight of it like static in the air. After breakfast, my husband announced he needed to make a few calls, something about work that couldn't wait. He went upstairs with his phone in hand, and I listened to his footsteps fade above me. The house felt split, the life we were supposed to have upstairs, and the truth of what had happened lingering down here. I cleaned the dishes slowly, my hands in warm water, watching the sunlight stretch across the sink. He stood near the counter, drying plates, the same way he had before my husband came back. It was such a small thing, but it didn't feel small. Every gesture now felt like a reminder of what had happened, of what couldn't be undone. The day dragged on, long and heavy. My husband moved between phone calls and paperwork, occasionally coming down for coffee or to ask a question. Each time he entered the kitchen, the room stiffened. His father and I would stand a little farther apart, speak a little less. We were careful. Too careful. In the afternoon, my husband suggested we take a walk around the yard. He wanted to see the repairs, the work that had been done while he was away. We walked together, the three of us, past the fence, past the garden, past the pool with its thin film of leaves floating on the surface. He nodded at things, making casual remarks, unaware, or maybe just pretending not to see, how differently we all moved now. By evening, the weight of the day had settled into my chest. I made dinner again, and we ate together, though it felt nothing like together. Every clink of a fork against a plate sounded like an interruption. Every glance felt like it could give away too much. When the dishes were cleared, my husband went back upstairs, saying he needed to finish an email. I stood in the kitchen, drying my hands on a towel, staring at the countertop. His father sat at the table, his hands folded, eyes downcast. Neither of us spoke. It wasn't anger between us. It wasn't even shame anymore. It was something heavier, the understanding that what had happened wasn't a secret that could simply vanish. It would live here now, in this house, in these walls, in every shared glance. That night, I lay beside my husband, listening to his steady breathing. The room was dark, the air thick. I stared at the ceiling, my hand resting on the blanket, my mind turning over and over the choices I had made. There were no words left to make sense of it. No explanation that could erase what had been done, no promise that could rebuild what had been broken. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full of everything said and unsaid, of every moment that had led us here, of every consequence waiting just beyond tomorrow. I closed my eyes, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily, and for the first time, I understood, some lines, once crossed, don't just change the story, they become the story.